Hey everybody, I'm Matt. This is the 10-Minute Bible Hour podcast, and I watched a video this week where dad was staying home for the first time with his little baby, and they seemed to be having a nice day. They listened to some music, he reported. They played with some toys, and he reported the kiddo ate well. I think this is probably a video for his wife to reassure her that things were going great, and it's kind of your first day back out on your own doing some stuff, and the bases are covered here. Don't worry about me and little baby Teddy. We heated up some of mommy's milk, and he ate great, and it went really well. And then dad holds up the kid, and he's like, look at how happy we are. And the kid starts making this face, but the dad's looking into the camera. And then warm breast milk starts coming out of the kid's nose and mouth and just all over the dad's face. It's disgusting. And my kids are horrified by the thing. I'm like, well, this is parenthood. Like that happened to me with all of you guys, and I love you, and it was worth it. But yeah, I mean, it's a little bit of a turd in the punch bowl, to be sure, when you're having one of these beautiful dad-kid moments and it ends with some kind of body fluid from you little twerps ending up on me. It does detract from the moment, is the point. Likewise, in Matthew chapter 22, we have this multifaceted parable that Jesus is saying in the proximity of the religious leadership, his enemies at the time, the people who wanted to get rid of him, kill him even. And as he is expressing this parable and we are going along with it as the audience, we're like, man, this thing's got some pretty wild ups and downs. But where we left it when we were talking the other day, I mean, it feels like this thing lands in a decent place with kind of a nice moral to the story. The parable I'm talking about goes like this. It's verses 1 through 14. Jesus spoke to them again in parables, saying, the kingdom of heaven is like, so same formula that we've used for a ton of the parables that Jesus has taught so far. Clearly, parables like this are meant to describe the kingdom of heaven. That's very easy to forget. And so sometimes we might want to accidentally extrapolate these out and apply them to a whole bunch of different little life situations here or there, things about politics or relationships or whatever. And maybe there's some secondary parallel there. But when Jesus starts a parable saying the kingdom of heaven is like, we know that he is talking about the kingdom of heaven because of the words he has said. The kingdom of heaven is like a king who prepared a wedding banquet for his son. He sent his servants to those who'd been invited to the banquet to tell him to come, but they refused to come. So you got this save the date thing, like within this date range, we're going to be ready. And my son, the prince, is going to have this party and celebration. You are the land-holding, title-holding nobles. Of course, you guys would come to the party. But then he sent some more servants and said, hey, tell those who've been invited that I've prepared my dinner. My oxen and fattened cattle have been butchered. Everything's ready. Come to the wedding banquet. But they paid no attention. That is, the invitees paid no attention. And they went off, one to his field, another to his business. They're terribly busy. They have important stuff there. That last part paraphrases mine. So that's pretty rude, but some of them are even worse. It says some of them, they seized his servants, mistreated them, and killed them. What? The king was enraged, and he sent his army and destroyed those murderers and burned their cities. Well, from the previous passage, we know that the people he's talking to, the religious leaders, like they get that is what a king or a landowner is going to do when you mistreat or kill one of their servants. I mean, at the end of chapter 21, after a parable where some tenants killed the landowner's son who went to just simply collect rent, the religious leaders, again, who Jesus is talking to, are like, that landowner, I'll tell you what he's going to do. He's going to bring those wretches to a wretched end, and then he's going to give that vineyard to somebody else. And Jesus implicitly is like, obviously. So that's movement number one in the story, and it feels like, oh, gross. Well, I mean, I guess we get some revenge, but I kind of wanted there to be a party, and now there's not a party. The story stinks. But then he said to his servants, the wedding banquet's ready, but those I invited didn't deserve to come. Go to the street corners and invite to the banquet anyone you find. Now, that street corners word right there in the NIV that I'm using, New International Version's one of the more popular modern translations of the Bible, but there are a whole bunch of others that are also very popular. You'll see a little bit of variation on that word right there, street corners. The Greek word behind it, I don't remember exactly what it is, but it's something that sounds a lot like the word Exodus. And it is only used once in the New Testament, if I recall correctly, and people don't know quite what to do with it, whether it means street corners as you get here, or I think highways and byways is how it's translated in some other versions. But it could also mean like out at the very edges of the city, the very fringes of what is still considered the city or the holdings of this king. And it's kind of interesting because the meaning does change a little bit. I don't bring stuff like this up very often in passing because there isn't that much stuff like this very often in passing. Most of the words in the New Testament get used and reused enough that you can establish context. But on this one, it adds an interesting wrinkle depending on how you read it, because of what he's saying is go to the street corners and get whoever you find there. Well, I mean, come on, who do you find on street corners? Remember 2 parables earlier in chapter 21 when we get the parable about the 2 sons who were asked to go work, and the first one's like, yeah, I'm not going to do that. And then he does. And the other one's like, yeah, I'll do that. And then he doesn't. And then Jesus, to the religious leaders, he's like, well, which one of these 2 did what the Father wanted? And they're like, well, and the one who actually worked. And then Jesus says to them, what is this? This is 21 and verse 31. I tell you the truth, the tax collectors and the prostitutes are entering the kingdom of God ahead of you. For John came to you to show you the way of righteousness, and you didn't believe him, but the tax collectors and prostitutes did. And even after you saw this, you didn't repent and believe him. So he's contrasting them with people who you would find on street corners. So it's just kind of interesting because if you translate that word as street corners, it sort of speaks back into what Jesus is saying in the immediate context 2 parables earlier. If you read it more like highways and byways or out at the edges, where the sidewalk ends, then it's like, oh, you're going to the very ends of the earth. And then that would seem to correspond a lot more to Acts 1:8, which is where you get this Acts commissioning as Jesus is ascending and the disciples are like, hey, we want a reckoning. Like, let's go and solve all of this Israel thing right now. And Jesus is like, nope. First, you're going to be my witnesses to Jerusalem, Judea, Samaria, and to the ends of the earth. And so maybe the original Greek-speaking audience would have heard this and been like, street corners, prostitutes like before. Or maybe the original Greek-speaking audience would have heard this parable and been like, ooh, that's another hint at this theme of the Abrahamic covenant and this thing being a blessing to all the nations. And maybe the original audience wouldn't have heard that uniformly at all, and both of those meanings might have been conjured. I don't know. It's just interesting to acknowledge that. Thank you for indulging my little rabbit trail here back to the story. So the servants go out to the streets or street corners or to the ends of the road where the sidewalk ends, or the highways and byways, whatever you want to call it, and they gathered all the people they could find, both good and bad, and the wedding hall was filled with the guests. Thinking as you flow along that the story is presenting a contrast between the fancy nobility, landed, titled elites who couldn't be troubled to come to this wedding and don't have a sense of their standing in society and are not assuming a right posture before the king. It feels like it's a contrast between the fancies and the not fancies. But if you note that parenthetical, then you see that what's actually happening here is that within this subgroup of not fancies, you've also got good and bad. But you see what's happening here. The text is acknowledging, Jesus is acknowledging that the disparity between everything isn't just like, do you have stuff and do you not? That's a Marxist read on things. It's the oppressor-oppressed matrix for interpretation that really didn't exist until about 150 years ago and has only been popular for about 100 years. And we're tempted to see that in everything, but nobody would have interpreted it that way here. That wouldn't have been the natural read. People are not automatically bad in the first century because they have some sort of land and title, and they're not automatically good because they're poor. And this passage would be reflective of that common understanding. Or I suppose if somebody in the original audience did understand this in kind of a proto-Marxist way, this would be a pushback to say, no, poor does not automatically equal good. There are flawed people within all demographics. There are people who can, in this case, recognize the king and assume the right posture before the king in all demographics. Whatever the case, the wedding hall is filled with guests, and it feels like that's the end. You got this rejection of the fancies and the bad people. They got punished, and it's kind of dark, and there's the specter of that city getting burned that hangs over this party, but we got to our party, and the result is that normal people got to be a part, and that sounds nice, but that is a false summit to the story. Now we get to the part where the stressful but pleasant, somewhat satisfying resolution to the story gets the baby barf put on top of it, and we're back to horrifying discomfort. Verse 11, but when the king came in to see the guests, he noticed a man there who was not wearing wedding clothes. Friend, he asked, how did you get in here without wearing wedding clothes? The man was speechless. Then the king told the attendants, "Tie him hand and foot and throw him outside into the darkness, where there'll be weeping and gnashing of teeth, for many are invited, but few are chosen." What? Come on, we had the lesson we wanted. It even fits with how we think about the world right now. That would have been fine, but instead we get some weird judgment theme at the end. What, the guy didn't have nice enough clothes? Like, come on, think about what he's been through. Think about how difficult life can be for some. Maybe he couldn't afford the nice clothes. What the heck? Well, that what the heck is what we're going to try to sort through tomorrow as we do our best to make sense of this bit of regurgitated breast milk all over the face of this parable. Boy, did I ride that mental imagery all the way to the finish line. I'll try to stop doing that in the future. Also, I think it would be prudent of me not to mention anything about Patreon after all of that, because if I were in your shoes, I think that would be the last place I would want to go after the imagery that I just put in your head. Okay, we're just going to leave it there. Thanks for being good sports. I'm Matt. This is the 10-Minute Bible Hour Podcast. Let's do this again soon.